as I was driving, the news came on and the announcement happened. Chrysler and Daimler would combine. I was absolutely shocked. Hello and welcome to the Auto Ethnographer. I'm John Stech, your host on this journey. We travel the globe to bring you stories about culture and the global automotive industry. Fasten your seatbelt and let's get started. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Auto Ethnographer. This is an episode that I have been looking forward to airing for a long time, one that I've put a lot of thought into and is based on some of my personal experiences over 9 years. The reason I'm posting it now is that just last week, on the 8th of May, it was would have been the 27-year anniversary of the announcement of the formation of DaimlerChrysler. This supposed merger of equals was touted to bring all sorts of savings and efficiencies and further reach for two large companies, Daimler, namely Mercedes-Benz, as well as Chrysler, a company based in the United States. Unfortunately, it failed. After 9 years, the marriage broke up, and it was widely regarded by many people as being just irreconcilable differences between two cultures, the Germans and the Americans. Frankly, I feel different about that. I don't think that's the case. Yes, the cultural frictions did have a role. There's no doubt about it. But ultimately, what really sank the merger was just simply there were no efficiencies, there were no savings, and there was pretty much no technology sharing between the two brands. Simply put, money talks, and this did not produce. I had pretty interesting experiences with Daimler Chrysler, given that I worked under the company for 9 years. I pretty much split my time 50-50 between the Mercedes-Benz side, where I started when the entire thing was launched, and then I finished at the end of the merger on the Chrysler side, focused a little bit more on the Chrysler side. So I've seen global headquarters operations with Mercedes-Benz with global roles. I had domestic roles for the US market with Mercedes, and very similar on the Chrysler side. I worked in the global headquarters for 4 years, as well as working in one of the markets domestically. So I've seen a lot. I also participated in uncountable numbers of meetings between the two sides when we had shared discussions that were between the German side and the American side with regards to certain business decisions or business planning. I do understand that my experience was unique. Everybody had a unique experience during those 9 years. I know that some people experienced Daimler Chrysler as something very positive, while other people had disdain the entire time for either the Mercedes-Benz side or for the Chrysler side. This was something that everybody had their own personal experience. But my story, my personal story, is one of trying to straddle between the two cultures, between the two companies, and to get it to work. I wanted to have success. I wanted it to be functional and workable because I knew as a German American that it is absolutely possible for these two cultures to work harmoniously together. So let's get started with the story now. In the beginning, it was a big surprise, a really big surprise. I was driving on May 8th, 1998 on the New York State Thruway from my home at that time in upstate New York down to the Montvale, New Jersey office of Mercedes-Benz USA, which I'll just keep calling it MBUSA from now on. I was driving, and yes, back then, one listened to the radio in the car or CDs. It was certainly not the same state of technology that we have today. And as I was driving, the news came on, and the announcement happened. Chrysler and Daimler would combine. I was absolutely shocked. I drive a little bit too fast anyway, and it's genetic, I think. And I just had to pull over. I couldn't concentrate on driving and concentrate on this news announcement and some of the quotes and so on that were coming out about this giant merger. So I pulled over on the side of the road and listened to the whole thing, and I was shocked. I couldn't believe that Mercedes-Benz and Chrysler would combine. I had been working for Mercedes-Benz at this point in time for about 2.5 years, starting in a global role. And at that exact moment when the announcement came, I was in a role responsible for product management of SUVs at Mercedes-Benz USA. Well, when the announcement was over and we went into a commercial break on the radio, I merged back into traffic and I continued driving to the office in Montvale. And when I arrived, of course, everybody was talking about it. I think no work got done that morning because everyone was talking about this news announcement. People were looking up articles. They were calling contacts in Stuttgart to find out what was going on, trying to understand exactly, where was this going? How did this happen? Um, it was something that was at the beginning hammered out by a very small number of executives. That's why nobody knew. They were extremely secretive about it and meeting in a small hotel in Germany and also having some meetings in the United States very secretively, hammering out this deal. It would be called in the beginning the merger of equals. That was how it was sold. Jürgen Schremp was the, let's say, co-CEO in the beginning with Bob Eaton, who had been the CEO at Chrysler. But very quickly, it became clear that it was not so much a merger of equals, right? Schremp was the more senior CEO in the relationship. Bob Eaton would leave very quickly after the announcement, not really living out as the company's co-CEO. Schremp was really the kind of the architect of this. He had been in a variety of different roles at Mercedes-Benz before in their truck unit, I think in their aerospace unit, and now he had this vision of bringing this, you know, giant automaker to light, something that would cover all the major automaking regions in the world. So here was a European company now merging with an American company to cover the Americas, or specifically North America, and later there would be a stake acquired in Mitsubishi, something that would then, of course, put a footprint in Asia as well. On that day, we didn't know many of these things on the first day, but I would say by the end of the day, we started getting the initial feedback, for example, from the customer call center at Mercedes-Benz, the CAC, as it was called, Customer Assistance Center. And it was very interesting, the feedback that we got. So the Mercedes-Benz customers were calling in and essentially saying, "Oh my God, this is really this can't happen, right? This is going to spoil the brand. If you start to build Mercedes-Benz cars at Chrysler factories, what's going to happen with the quality? What's going to happen with the prestige of the brand? We don't like this. We may have to consider not, buying another Mercedes-Benz." So that was the reaction of the Mercedes customers on day one of the announcement. And then you had the Chrysler, Jeep, and Dodge customers, surprisingly, were calling the Mercedes-Benz CAC and also, you know, giving a message. But their message was vastly different. It was welcome to the family. Uh, this was really a contrast. And ultimately, I have to say, this was a little bit of a foreshadowing of what would happen with the merger in the future from the perspective of Mercedes-Benz behaving in one way and Chrysler behaving in a different way. Really a foreshadowing of the future. But for me, I was excited. I was a German American. I speak both languages fluently. I'm fluid with both cultures, understanding them both very well, and able to work within both cultures very effectively. So for me, this was an incredible announcement. I could only imagine what kind of opportunities would lay ahead for me, being a bit selfish at that particular moment in time. But over time, I would be able to experience having career opportunities on both sides of this giant new company. The next months leading up to the actual merger were pretty busy from a corporate perspective. So there were about 6 months between the announcement that the company would form and the actual listing on the New York Stock Exchange, which happened in November 1998. Being at Mercedes-Benz USA, we were in a sales company. We were a little bit removed from the PMI, the post-merger integration activities, and those were primarily occurring at the headquarters level. The only big stir that we had at Mercedes-Benz USA was when the company sold a piece of land on Blue Hill in Pearl River, New York. This was a piece of land that had been meant to build a new headquarters just across the line, state line from Montvale, New Jersey, in Pearl River, New York, to relocate the headquarters into another state, but still to stay local and to retain the local employees. Well, when that land was sold, not too long after the announcement of the merger, of course, this stirred up a lot of conversation and rumors in the grapevine that the company was going to, move all of the Mercedes-Benz personnel and the sales company and merge it in some way over to Auburn Hills, Michigan, where Chrysler was located, in a way to get some sort of savings, right, with distribution and planning and logistics and back office and finance and human resources and so on and so forth. But those fears didn't last very long because the German upper management in Stuttgart, they quickly tamped this down and assured everybody that Mercedes-Benz USA would stay in its New Jersey seat. On a parallel side, now we get right into the product, something which I love to talk about and love to deal with even to this day. There was an exchange of cars. So Mercedes-Benz USA shipped 2 trailerfuls of cars, Mercedes-Benz's, over to Auburn Hills. And at the same time, Chrysler shipped 2 trailerfuls of cars over to New Jersey. So while Auburn Hills received SLKs and SLs and S classes and E classes and so on, including the M class SUV, there was a receipt of Jeeps, the Grand Cherokee, the Cherokee, Chrysler 300, I think Dodge Intrepid, and a couple of other models. I think there was a Dodge Ram pickup truck, now of course known by the Ram brand. But I think very interestingly, what mesmerized the staff at Mercedes-Benz USA was the Viper. Yeah, yep, that's right. Chrysler sent a Dodge Viper over to Montvale, and it was a manual transmission car. So this limited a little bit who was able to drive it, knowing that not many people are manual transmission drivers. But this car made its rounds through the executive management and ultimately through the product management, which I was a part of. Everybody was more than happy to sign up and drive the Viper and experience the very raw power of the Viper, which is of course on the opposite end of the spectrum of the very refined Mercedes-Benz passenger cars. I guess it was probably the manual transmission and somebody who wasn't particularly adept at driving it, but eventually the Viper was sidelined because something wasn't working on it in the end. On a funny note, there was word that even the German executives from Stuttgart were always asking about the Wiper, which interestingly enough is the way that they would pronounce the American V. And clearly this vehicle stimulated the imaginations and the curiosity of the Mercedes-Benz world, again because of the juxtaposition to the refined vehicles from Mercedes-Benz. DaimlerChrysler officially came into existence on what they called Day One. This was the listing day on the New York Stock Exchange, and it happened on November 17th, 1998. The company pulled out all stops, and they filled Wall Street with a huge complement of its products, from across the globe. Parked out on the street, there were Jeeps, there were Mercedes-Benz passenger cars, there were Freightliner heavy trucks. There was even a Eurocopter, because at that time we had Daimler Aerospace as one of the subsidiaries of Daimler-Benz. I had the opportunity to stand out there on Wall Street and actually even to get out onto the floor of the stock exchange, because as a product manager, I had the responsibility to stand with an M class out on Wall Street and to talk to journalists about the M-Class SUV, or even just passersby, people who were going to work, who would see, this big spectacle going on the street. It was a very exciting day. Everybody, participated in one way or another across the globe on day one. I was very lucky to be able to be on Wall Street when the big event happened. Globally, one of the things that did happen for every employee on the planet was they received a day one welcome kit. And the day one welcome kit had brochures in it. It was a kind of a plastic binder box made out of a corrugated, semi-transparent plastic material. You opened it up, you had a brochure inside, multiple brochures that showed all of the different products that the company produced, regardless of brand. It showed the employees from around the planet. It gave an introduction on the vision and the goals of Daimler Chrysler. It showed who was in the executive management, showed that there were representatives from both sides of the family at the upper echelons of the company. I think the most famous piece from the welcome kit, from the day one welcome kit, was the custom made Swatch watch. Every employee on the planet received this Swatch watch. It had the word Daimler Chrysler written onto the watch, on the watch band. And many people, frankly, still own them today. I have mine. I've never worn the watch, and all of the brochures are still in my kit. I don't know if this thing will ever have any kind of historical value one day, but it's there and ready anytime that I want to part with it. Those were exciting times. Those early days, they were very heady, but soon the challenges would begin. And for me, they would begin a little bit sooner than for some of the other areas in the company. One of the first things that two companies in a similar field have to look at is whether they have overlapping products, and whether those overlapping products are an issue and going after the same customer, and whether it's efficient to continue to produce both of those overlapping products. So of all the products in the lineups of Mercedes-Benz and Chrysler, there were essentially only two overlapping products. And amazingly, both of them were under my purview as a product manager for the US market. One was the Mercedes-Benz M-Class, which overlapped with the Jeep Grand Cherokee. And the other was an overlap between the Chrysler Town and Country, premium or even luxury minivan, and a planned Mercedes-Benz model codename BR251 minivan, which was, planned to occur sometime in the early 2000s. It was in the planning phase when the merger was announced. There was a lot of discussion about the minivan, and frankly, it was a very quick decision that the Mercedes-Benz version, the BR251, would be dropped, and that only the Chrysler, the Town and Country, as well as some of the Dodge branded models would be the company's minivan product offering. It didn't make any sense for Mercedes-Benz to engineer something in parallel. So that was a very, very quick decision, relatively painless, because the Mercedes-Benz version was still very early in the conversation. But then there was the Grand Cherokee and the Mercedes M-Class. As I said, both of the products were very familiar to me. I had been working on the M-Class for the previous, really 2.5 years, 3 years. And I was very familiar with the product, both from a global perspective and also from the domestic US perspective. In June 1998, Chrysler had just revealed, shortly after the announcement of the merger, a new Grand Cherokee, the 1999 model year Grand Cherokee, which was codenamed the WJ74. This was revealed to the press in Detroit, and the product was the second generation to the Grand Cherokee. The first one was quite wildly successful, with hundreds of thousands sold per year. So very successful product. The second generation promised to actually be more successful. It was a better engineered product, more off-road capability, more luxurious than the first generation. It was revealed to the dealers specifically, where they had the first direct view and access to the vehicle in September 1998. This was when Chrysler organized, or the Jeep brand organized, a dealer meeting in Vail, Colorado, and they wanted to launch the model and show it to the retailers at an event in Colorado, both in terms of the product information, but also to actually drive the car and have some experience with it. The company planned this dealer meeting in Colorado at the Dobson Ice Arena in the center of Vail. They had this large dealer meeting. They squeezed in a lot of people into this arena, and they had presentation on the product and on some of the other strategic issues that were facing Chrysler at that particular moment in time. But the focus was, of course, heavily on the Grand Cherokee. It was a perfect location because, again, it fits very naturally to the Jeep brand. This also was accompanied by a second location not too far from Vail, and this is Camp Hale, an old military training camp from the U.S. military. It's slightly to the south and to the west of Vail. Here they had an official Camp Jeep planned. The Camp Jeep, where consumers would also be able to come bring their Jeeps to have kind of a Jeep jamboree, as some of them were called, and see some of the products, see some of the concept vehicles, as well as new products that the brand would have. But at this moment in time, that Camp Jeep area was reserved specifically for the dealer meeting, where they would have the chance to look at the car, drive the car, feel the car, experience the car for the first time. This was a huge breakthrough for me to attend this event. I was responsible for the only product that overlapped in the U.S. market with a Jeep product, and so I was nominated to be the representative from MB USA to go out to Colorado and to attend this dealer meeting, and to finally meet some of the people from the Chrysler side of the family. So this is September. It's about 5 months after the announcement of the merger. And finally, I would come face to face with some of the people from the Chrysler side. It was interesting because I had the opportunity to meet some of the highest level executives at the company. People like Jim Holden, who would be president of Chrysler for a period of time after the merger. Jim Donlan, the CFO. Ray Fisher, in charge of fleet. Bud Liebler, in charge of marketing and communications. As well as many more, including Christine Cortez, who would end up later running the service and parts across the globe for all of Daimler Chrysler. It struck me that these executives were so approachable, personable, very easygoing. And I have to be very honest, they were very different from the more starched personalities that I knew at that executive level in Stuttgart. They invited me on a Jeep Wrangler drive where we drove up to the top of a 13,000-foot mountain in open top Wranglers, and quite an adventure, I have to admit. Something that I love doing, having been an off-road enthusiast in the past. This was definitely a relationship icebreaker to meet these people and to talk about our overlapping products. Just as I was curious about them and about Chrysler, and asking lots of questions about the company and the Jeep brand and so on, they were just as curious about me. And they were curious about my activities as the head of the M class and what that product meant to the Mercedes-Benz brand. They also asked a lot of questions about working with Germans in Stuttgart. They looked at me and saw an American and asked me a lot of questions about how did I get along with Stuttgart? How was it to work with them? They already had, of course, at the highest executive level, lots of exposure to Stuttgart, but they still had a lot of questions. When I confessed to them about being a German American, they had even more questions because they realized that I would have some insights, working on both sides from both perspectives as a German and an American. But this really stoked their questions, and we had some pretty in-depth discussions about the two cultures, and whether I thought that they could work together, they could function harmoniously and exist, within one large corporate structure. But the fun only can happen for so long. Being out in Vail, Colorado, and doing my research and understanding the Grand Cherokee, the new one, taking a look even at the owner's manual and driving it and just exploring the car from one end to the other. There has to come a time when you have to have the discussion about the overlapping products and how do we manage that. So, following the listing of the company on the New York Stock Exchange in November 1998, it was really time to get down to business and to, for the company overall to look for efficiencies and savings and to deal with any of the product overlaps that we had. Again, in my case, it was really only one. Under a German boss in Tuscaloosa, Alabama area, where Mercedes-Benz had established its manufacturing foothold for SUVs, starting production in 1997. I had spent 3 years working on the product management, the pricing strategy, the product lifecycle strategy of the M class, going through the strategy period into the launch period and then ultimately into the sales stage. First globally from the Tuscaloosa seat I had, and then moving to MB USA, which was more focused on the US market. The M class discussion would ultimately, for me, be a challenging one in juxtaposition to the Grand Cherokee. We heard at Mercedes-Benz that right after the post-merger integration team had started its work in the summer of 1998, that the Jeep truck engineering team located in Detroit, as well as the product planning team up in Auburn Hills, that they questioned the need for an M class. They thought that the vehicle could be dropped. The initial target of that vehicle was actually aimed at the Grand Cherokee, as well as high level trims of the Ford Explorer, because at that moment in time there were no luxury brands on the market with luxury SUVs. It was traditional brands that built upscale level models, again, like the Grand Cherokee, the Ford Explorer. But that positioning was really only theoretical in 1996 when we were getting ready to launch. Because in reality, in 1997, Toyota launched with its Lexus RX 320. That one came first. Next, about a year and a half later, would come the BMW X5, a direct German branded challenger to the M class. So the world had already changed significantly by the time we were sitting together in January of 1999, when we would ultimately meet to have that hard discussion about whether or not an M class would be necessary. The Grand Cherokee was selling on the order of 3-1 in terms of the volume globally between the two vehicles. So while the M class was selling less, it certainly was not a small number of sales either. The factory had been planned for about 80,000 sales, 80,000 production, I should say, in Tuscaloosa. In fact, in the early days, they even established production in Graz, Austria, just to make up for the capacity that Tuscaloosa did not have for the demand that was occurring in Europe. It was decided to have a big SUV summit at the Jeep Truck Engineering Facility, which was at the time located in the historic but unfortunately now demolished Kelvinator headquarters building in the city of Detroit. Very historic location, and actually really beautiful building with a nice clock tower out front. Very notable architecture. We were planning to meet and discuss the two SUVs immediately on the heels of the Detroit Motor Show of 1999, which at that time was still called the North American International Auto Show, as many international reveals were still held at the show at that time. This has changed significantly now in the current time, where really nearly no global reveals are done at Detroit anymore. I would fly in with a couple of my colleagues from MBUSA, and we would meet up then with some colleagues flying in from Stuttgart, who were responsible for the global product management of the M class, the team that I used to be a part of. I just want to note that in episode 3 of the Auto Ethnographer, I had been joined by Dr. Helmut Größer. He mentioned this meeting, and I'm going to talk about it again, but I'm going to inject a little bit more color and a little bit more detail into the conversation here, because I think this meeting really exemplified some of the, let's say, cultural differences between the American side of the family and the German side. This really would be very indicative of the future. And we were only a few months into the merger. You have a real juxtaposition between the more structured, planning, disciplined German side of the family, and then you can compare that a little bit to the more, let's say, freewheeling and flexible way that American managers tend to work. It's a bit different, and it certainly came to light in this conversation. So the room filled with about 15 to 20 people. I don't remember the exact count. It's been a long time ago. About 5 or 6 of those people were from Mercedes-Benz, representatives, like I mentioned, from Stuttgart, plus from MBUSA. And as I looked around the room at the beginning of the meeting, here was a classic old style conference room in this old historic building, a U-shaped table leading up to a screen, an overhead projector. Yes, I'm aging myself. There were still overheads being used, overhead slides that we could use throughout the meeting. And as I looked around, I saw that the American colleagues from the Jeep team, both the product management folks from Auburn Hills as well as from the Jeep Truck Engineering, they came in with a notepad and a pencil or a pen. And it struck me. I didn't see any other kind of material on the desk or on the table in front of them. Meanwhile, as I would say is probably typical for the Mercedes-Benz or from a German perspective, we opened up our briefcases on the table. Each of us, I think, pulled out a 3-ring binder, and each binder was full of, I would say, anywhere from 2 centimeters to 7 centimeters thick of overhead slides. I think each of us had 100 slides minimum, with all sorts of data that we had, plucked from syndicated studies looking at consumer behavior, looking at consumer demographics, looking at the pricing, the positioning of the M class, looking at the Grand Cherokee, looking at the product, the specifications of the product, everything, every possible point you can imagine, we had a slide. There were hundreds of those slides. While the Grand Cherokee had been launched in the early 90s and had, almost a decade of data, hundreds of thousands of customers, probably almost 1 million customers by that point in time. There were so many vehicles on the road, they really knew their customer. With the Mercedes M class, we had just launched about a year and a half before, so we didn't have as much data, but we focused on the global markets. We also focused very heavily on the U.S. market, which was the largest market at the time, selling probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the M classes on the planet, and tried very hard to understand who is the customer, and that knowledge would help us very much in this conversation. The colleagues from Jeep Truck Engineering, they were speaking at a higher level. They certainly knew their information. They certainly knew the customer. They understood the pricing and the positioning of the product, but it was all taken, from their head. It was not taken from any kind of data sheets or overhead slides. Just a kind of open general conversation, and I think in this particular case, it truly helped on our side, the Mercedes-Benz side at that time, to have that conversation about the M class, because we really did go into the detail, and we proved, to use a legal term, we proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the customers between the M Class and the Grand Cherokee were completely different in terms of education, in terms of income, in terms of hobbies, in terms of travel. On almost every comparison, the customers were different. The usage of the vehicles was different. The Jeep clearly positioned much more off-road. The M Class had initially been positioned a bit off-road, but frankly, the Mercedes-Benz customers were not taking them off-road. The car was really used as a Mercedes-Benz would be, you would think, as an on-road highway type driver or for the daily driving. So it was felt during that meeting by the end that yes, the minds had been changed and the two vehicles could exist harmoniously on the market together without, poaching customers between the one and the other. There would be several more high level meetings taking place in which I did not participate, but those meetings ultimately came to that same conclusion, and upper management decided that the two vehicles would stay. The M Class would continue on in its life cycle. The Grand Cherokee, of course, would stay, uh, and has gone through multiple life cycles since. There was even discussion that eventually one day the two vehicles could potentially share a platform, even though one was more road oriented and one would be more off road oriented. For me, life changed a little bit at Mercedes Benz in the fall of 2001. I shifted into a completely new role, something that was very new to me. It was volume planning. Up until now at Mercedes-Benz for several years, I had, spent my time in product management and, focused on all of the slew of SUVs that would be coming into the product portfolio of Mercedes-Benz. My team even prepared and paved the way and ultimately launched the G-Wagon on the US market, but I would not be part of the product management team at the time of the launch. My successor took over that role and launched that product, which has become really ubiquitous on city streets now. You see G-Wagons everywhere. It's an incredibly popular, extremely expensive, extremely premium product. Well, I moved over into volume planning. I took over the strategic volume planning department at MBUSA. And at the time, the brand had just broken the 200,000 unit sales mark. And by doing so, they also happened to displace both Cadillac and Lincoln from their top spots as luxury brands in the US market. Until that point in time, the American brands had actually dominated the market. And I think nobody had ever exceeded them in sales at any point ever. There was even a celebration where every employee at Mercedes-Benz USA received a Bose Wave sound system that even had printed on it the fact that Mercedes-Benz was the number one selling luxury brand in the United States at that point in time. So that was the setting. The brand was already very successful, on a roll. Lots of new model lines had been launched over the previous couple of years going into 2001. So on September 1st, 2001, I took over the role of head of strategic volume planning. 11 days later, tragedy struck. That was when the terrorists attacked the World Trade Center. Thousands of people were killed and injured, and some, of course, with long-term illness based on the dust that they breathed from the site of the tragedy. This would have an immediate impact on the economy and a very quick impact on the auto industry. This was when companies like General Motors and Ford would roll out employee pricing as for the very first time, I believe, to offset the almost stoppage of sales in the last months of 2001 and going into 2002. Mercedes-Benz had the plan to increase from that roughly 200,000 mark by about 10% and to stretch itself with even more new models that were being added to the product portfolio. And so I should have been working on a growth strategy together with the sales department and marketing department, to reach that 10% growth. But instead, I found myself for the very first next month's planning submission to the headquarters in Stuttgart actually cutting the volume plan by about 10% or even a little bit more. As long as we tried to stay above the 200,000 mark for 2002. Unfortunately, there was a personal tragedy within my own team, my volume planning team, and this would also lead to having to rebuild our internal volume planning system at MBUSA. And this happened exactly at the moment that the global headquarters was trying to roll out an online planning system that would match up to our local system to do the planning submissions into the headquarters. So very challenging times at that moment. After spending about 1 year in this strategic volume planning position and overcoming the challenges we had, number one, with trying to reach the target, the sales target of the company, with rebuilding our internal system at MBUSA following this internal tragedy that we had in the department, and then also adopting this new system in Germany from Stuttgart, this web-based system, I suddenly got a phone call from someone I had met on a big international Mercedes-Benz project about 2 years before. That person from Stuttgart had now moved to Auburn Hills, and he took on the role as the senior director of Chrysler International. Chrysler International was a unit inside of DaimlerChrysler at the Chrysler headquarters, responsible for about 120 countries where the company was selling its products, which were not in the then NAFTA agreement, right? So this was all the countries other than the United States, Canada, and Mexico. This person, as I mentioned, was German. He was a leader in Auburn Hills, Michigan, and he had some big challenges ahead of him. There was a big product offensive coming with new products to be rolled out globally, growing the business not just in the United States and Canada and Mexico, but to really grow the Chrysler business internationally, which was supposed to be one of those efficiencies and opportunities, synergies between the two companies to help Chrysler increase its international footprint. And I was asked if I would be willing to join the team over in Auburn Hills and to bring along some of my cultural knowledge in implementing some relatively big changes in Auburn Hills with the Chrysler team. This concludes part 1 of episode 12 on DaimlerChrysler and the merger of equals. Stay tuned tomorrow for episode 2. Thank you for joining us on today's journey. Please remember to like and subscribe to the Auto Ethnographer and leave us a rating or comment. For more information, visit our website at auto-ethnographer.com. You can also follow on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.